All right, y'all, come on, let's get at it. We got one more little sermonette connected to the heart of the matter. We've looked at Jesus' words in a very succinct and specific way. We've looked at some Paul's instruction in practical application of giving. We're going to continue in the text we started last week, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to look at chapter 9, starting in verse 6. Here is the text. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, their righteousness will endure forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. Through us, your generosity will result in the thanksgiving to God. So what I want to do here is encourage you at the promises of God that make us cheerful, generous givers who trust in Him. My prayer is that this will increase our joy in the faithfulness of giving. Those who are giving faithfully will press on in habits and behaviors that are honoring to the Lord. And those of you that may not understand the source of joy in giving would give yourself an opportunity to reflect on how might I be one who is joyful in my giving, cheerful in my giving, such that I might experience and have multiplied in my life the joy of God that we see in these texts and live from a place of both joy and freedom. I'm going to offer you. So, observation number 1. God is bad at math. God is bad at math. It's jacked up. Hear this. The best way to increase is to subtract. Whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will reap generously. Paul's using a basic farming principle that actually is really obvious in farming but counterintuitive in finances. Those who plant more harvest more. Those who give more get more. Those who keep more have less. Now, most people operate exactly the opposite as it relates to biblical principles. We have been taught that if we give more, we will have less. If we keep more, we will have more. But that takes God out of the equation. But it doesn't sound like good math, does it? 10 minus 9 in God's economy is more than 10 minus 0. 10 minus 9 in God's economy is more than 10 minus 0. You can say, no, it's not. There's no way that 9 is greater than 10. And yet, in the math of the kingdom, in the upside-down nature of God's power to multiply, those who give more have less, but actually have more as we factor God's peace, joy, and purpose into the way that we think about our finances. For many of us, the problem is we have left God out of the math. We have left His multiplying power for joy, for blessing, for abundance, and for peace out of the way that we think about our math. One of the things that brings me great joy every year, and I know this might seem odd to share publicly, but every year when we file our taxes, which we do through an online forum, at the end of the filing system, as it does through all the surveys, and it looks at all the different ways you've put your money in and accounted for charitable giving and your income and any other deductions, and it does all the factoring, it gives us an audit warning. And that audit warning is always your giving is disproportionate to your income. Not in a sense of being too low. What the tax instrument tells us as a family is that we are giving more than we should based on the income that we report. That means the percentages of our giving are beyond what is normal and maybe even what seems possible based on the income and the giving percentage. That is because we have factored God into the math. And we have determined that we're going to be generous, and even as we looked at last week, sometimes generous beyond what seems like we are able to be. Observation number 2, giving is determined in the heart. Each one of you must do as he has made up his mind, not reluctantly or under his heart or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Each one of you should do what you have decided in your heart to do. Giving is not determined by budget. It isn't determined by outlines and principles and patterns. Giving is determined by our heart. Observation number 3, and maybe this is where it's really important for us to camp, and especially as we think about, again, this cultural moment in which we're thinking about how to use our resources in response to a crisis, in response to the larger community need. God gives enough for us and abundance for others. God's power and grace combine with cheerful givers to give enough for them and abundance for others. Verse 8, and God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. The point is this, that God gives us what we need, but he gives us more than we need. The reason he does that is not so that we can store up the excess, not so that we can hoard for ourselves toilet paper and hand sanitizer, not that we can keep our money in reserves in case things don't go well, but so that we can provide for the good works, for the poor, for the missionaries, the church planters, for the various works of ministry at the Church of DCV, and into the city that we love in care of our neighbor and our family and others. This verse can be summed up that God gives enough for us and abundance for others. Or if you link it up with verse number 7, the reason God gives you more than you need is not so that you can reduce your joy in keeping it, but that you can increase your joy by giving it. Remember, God's wonderful way of calculating, if 10 minus 1 is more than 10 minus 0, then in this math equation, 15 minus 6 is a lot more than 15 minus 0. Think about that. Verse 8 helps us understand the meaning of and the design of wealth is simple. Wealth is the God-sent possibility of multiplying the joy of providing for every good work. Wealth is the God-sent possibility of multiplying the joy of providing for every good work. The passage says that God loves a cheerful giver, a person who finds satisfaction in giving, a giver who really loves to lavish people with the goodness of God. And therefore, God promises to provide abundantly for people like that so that they are self-sustained and sufficiently cared for, and that they can provide for every good work and make their joy go through the roof. And that is all about the one who then gets thanks. Their joy goes through the roof, and in all of these things, the outpouring of thanksgiving is not to people, but to God, who has formed a heart of generosity in people who, like all of us, are tempted to hold on in the just-in-case moments. Generous givers get joy. There is no other way to say it. Generous givers get joy. God, the source of generosity, gets the glory. And that's the hope and the heart of our church. That generous givers get the joy and that God gets all of the glory.
A certain flock of geese lived together in a barnyard with high walls around it. Because the corn was good and the barnyard was secure, these geese would never take a risk. One day, a philosopher goose came among them. He was a very good philosopher, and every week they listened quietly and attentively to his learned discourses. "My fellow travelers on the way of life," he would say, "can you seriously imagine that this barnyard, with great high walls around it, is all there is to existence? I tell you, there is another and greater world outside, a world of which we are only dimly aware. Our forefathers knew of this outside world, for did they not stretch their wings and fly across the trackless wastes of desert and ocean, of green valley and wooded hill? But alas, Here we remain in this barnyard, our wings folded and tucked into our sides, as we are content to puddle in the mud, never lifting our eyes to the heavens, which should be our home. The geese thought this was very fine lecturing. How poetical, they thought. How profoundly existential. What a flawless summary of the mystery of existence. Often the philosopher spoke of the advantages of flight, calling on the geese to be what they were. After all, they had wings, he pointed out. What were wings for but to fly with? Often he reflected on the beauty and the wonder of life outside the barnyard and the freedom of the skies. And every week the geese were uplifted, inspired, moved by the philosopher's message. They hung on his every word. They devoted hours, weeks, months to a thoroughgoing analysis and critical evaluation of his doctrines. They produced learned treatises on the ethical and spiritual implications of flight. All this they did. But one thing they never did. They did not fly. For the corn was good, and the barnyard was secure.